Okay, it's almost time, so let us begin. Let me open, and we will get started for this morning. Father, again we are thankful for the day you've given us, and this is the day that we would call the Lord's Day, but we freely acknowledge that every day is your day. But we're thankful that we can be together to study, to sing, to pray, to hear your word preached. We're thankful for your protection, your scriptures all these years, and we're also thankful for those who've come before us to write and to provide study aids for us to help us understand what you would have for us in your scriptures. Again, we're thankful for your goodness. We ask now that you guide our thinking, guide our discussion as we entertain this portion of your text. I ask in Jesus' name, amen. Let me welcome you to Grace Covenant Baptist Church, Monroe, Louisiana, on the 19th day of April, 2026, on a cool morning. It's really pleasant this morning. Looks like we may have about a week of spring before we start building into our heat and humidity that's typical for Northeast Louisiana that will probably last until November. So we'll enjoy this week of relatively cool weather. We're starting today, we're continuing in 2 Corinthians, but we're starting a new chapter and we're starting a whole new section of 2 Corinthians. You may remember, probably not, but you may, we started our study of 1st and 2nd Corinthians in March of 2022. So today we are 4 years and 1 month into this study. So you may also remember, or you may not remember, that when we started 1 Corinthians in March of 2022, I was doing the introduction, and I had talked about the fact that part of the material that I had when I taught 1 Corinthians before came from a preacher in California, and he talked about these two books could be titled 1st and 2nd Californians. And we talked about that it could be titled 1st and 2nd Louisianians or 1st and 2nd Monroeans. So after 4 years, that would still probably hold true. So we're going to start with chapter 11. We're starting with a new chapter, and as we said, we're starting with a whole new section. Chapter 11 begins the last major section in 2 Corinthians. It's the final chapters in this book. And Paul begins to deal with probably the most powerful and dangerous tool that is a threat to the church today. And we'll begin to detail that as we go through. So if you were driving here this morning, you probably passed 3 or 4 churches, maybe more depending on where you're coming from, right? Yes, no, maybe, don't know, didn't notice. Okay. So based on the number of churches that we pass, we would presume that Christianity, and I use that term very loosely, would be a predominant force in our culture today. Yeah, that would be a false presumption. Now, if that is true, that it's a false presumption, then we would have to ask why. Why is it that Christianity / church is not a moving force in our society today? Now, there's lots of reasons, but there's one predominant reason that Paul's going to address. Can you think of what that might be? Anybody? What's the moving force in our society? Okay. Many of these churches, well, I won't say many, some, are basically just empty buildings. They've got very few attendees. Their services could be described as ordinary, devoid of any real vitality. I dare ask anybody been there? So it's clear, if we accept that premise, it's clear that these churches represent, that the vitality that these churches represent has long since been gone. Which brings us back to our question, why? So, now the other extreme to that are the so-called mega churches, where we have multitudes that assemble on a Sunday, sometimes during the week, in multi-million-dollar buildings. They take part in a so-called worship, and their experiences are enhanced by what is typically called a praise team that's accompanied by an electric bass, an electric guitar, an electric keyboard, and multiple moving lights. Now, there are two common characteristics to both of these types of churches. It is infiltration for the ones that are, quote, dying. Leadership has allowed to come in false teaching. For our other type, it's syncretization. Leadership has allowed worldly methods to come in, and in both cases, dilute the true message. So, what we're going to talk about as we go through the first 15 verses of chapter 11. I'm only going to really concentrate on the first 5, and I'll talk about that later on about why I'm doing that. But as we begin to think about what Paul writes in these first 15 verses, then we begin to see some anecdotes to what has happened currently in our society. We knew from our previous studies in 1 Corinthians primarily, Paul is talking about interpersonal problems in the church, and he talks somewhat about how the gospel is practiced, if we can use that, the orthopraxy, how that's dispensed and how that's done. But it wasn't so much about, well, I hate to say this because it sounds bad, it wasn't so much about the gospel itself, it was how it was applied and how it was affecting those in the congregation. So, now he deals a lot with the gospel itself, but in 2 Corinthians, there's a change of tone, there's a change of focus. For one thing, he begins to defend himself. Remember back in 1 Corinthians, he also talks about the false teachers. Some call them intruders, some of them call them interlopers. We'll discuss that later. And he talks about it specifically in 2 Corinthians, and in these last 3 chapters, he begins to defend himself against those accusations. And against that basis, he begins to talk about the false doctrine as compared to the true doctrine. So he's beginning to talk more about orthodoxy, or the true doctrinal foundations as compared to the other. And we'll detail some of that as we go through. So we saw more recently in chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians, we noted the personal Corinthians that we must have in order to be effective in this difficulty. We saw pretty extensively how Paul discussed his humility, we saw also in chapter 10 that when we begin to compare ourselves to others, we're setting a new standard. And this standard can lead to self-comparison, which then, according to Paul, becomes foolishness. Hang on to that thought, because we're going to talk about being foolish. So, and we also saw in chapter 10 that Paul established the Corinthian church within the boundaries that God set up, not man. And that becomes important as well as we think about the false teachers, or the false, the interlopers. So as we begin to deal with chapter 11, we're going to look at some of the tactics that Paul used to counteract the threat to the church in Corinth. And these are some of the same tactics that we could use today. So we're going to do some historical stuff, we're going to do some theoretical stuff, and we're going to do some applicational stuff. You know, some of us may know some folks who are entering into some kind of heresy or some kind of false doctrine. So then the question becomes, what do we do about that? And this is part of what we can gather from what Paul is going to teach us. So as we look at the text in chapter 11, we're going to look at what Paul did, and we can use that as a model. Bless you. Again. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, another aspect of these last three chapters, Paul begins to defend himself. He didn't do a lot of that previously, although we did some. But in these last three chapters, he's going to specifically begin to defend himself against these accusations. So, it's almost as if he felt compelled to write honestly about himself and about those who opposed him at Corinth and those who had poisoned, so to speak, the Corinthians' mind against him. Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the frame, that's kind of the overlay that we're going to look at. The first 5 or 6 verses, we're going to take those apart. We're going to do some grammar. You all know I like grammar. So we're going to do some theoretical stuff, then we're going to do some applicational stuff. Okay? With your permission, then we will continue. We know that the opposition to Paul was serious. Not only on a personal level, although that was serious, but there's a greater seriousness, because in Matthew 10, verse 40, Christ himself said, "Whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me." So Paul didn't raise this issue of his apostolic authority for his own sake, but he raised it for the sake of receiving the one who sent me. Who receives me receives him who sent me. It's receiving the authority of Christ from God himself. Make sense? So we got a duality here. He's defending himself personally, but even in a greater sense, he's defending the gospel and he who sent that gospel. Okay? So in refusing to receive Paul, they are in essence refusing to accept the one who sent him. You think that might be a very dangerous thing to be going on in a church? Dare I say, do you think that may be part of what's going on contemporarily in our society? That's rhetorical. I don't expect an answer on that one. Okay, thinking structurally, We would notice that in the previous 10 chapters, we had both plural and singular pronouns. Paul would often talk about we, and we've said that we was Paul and his associates. In the final 3 chapters, the pronoun is singular. He almost exclusively says I. So we see a shift to a more personal frame, if you please. He's clearly indicating that the attacks of the opponents have been launched against him personally. Now, it's launched against the gospel. We know that, and we'll see that. But it's also launched against him personally. So a part of what he's doing in these last 3 chapters is he's defending himself, thus defending is the wrong word, protecting the one who sent him. So it's a much greater train of thought than just simply self-protection, although that is important. Okay, let's start with verse 1. We're going to start unpacking these. Verse 1 says, I'm reading ESV now. Some of y'all have a different translation. It said, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me. And there seems to be a please in there, although it's not in the text. The term bear means to put up with, to endure, to be patient. Foolishness means unwise, folly, lack of sense. Now, we tend to think of Paul as being a pretty serious guy. So this is really strange when he's saying to these folks, put up with a little foolishness. So how do we understand what he's saying about foolishness? Anybody have a guess? I need to take a breath. Anybody got a thought on that? Huh? Either one. Don't give me a long thought, so guess.
Well, as basic sense, the word means thoughtlessness. It means to not use your capability as you think. And it seems that what Paul is setting up here is the fact that they are not receiving or not practicing something that is very important to the long-term goals of the church.
Okay. Yeah.
And it seems to be foolishness to them because it, at least in their mind, it's working, whatever working is. But it is departing from the purest gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've already seen where he said self-comparison or comparison to others is foolishness. So we've already begun to establish that concept or that frame.
Step on the person who's teaching the next section's feet. This really, it's like he's almost channeling Proverbs 26, answer a fool according to its folly. So he's engaging in the foolishness that they have with their own bragging and everything that starts in verse 16 by bragging on himself here.
Yeah. Okay, let's do a little more foundational work. Let's go back into chapter 10. And let's start with verse 8. Paul says, for even if I, what? Boast a little too much, quantitatively, of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. Look at verse 13. But we will not, what? Boast beyond limits, but will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us to reach even you. Verse 15, we do not boast beyond limits in the labors of others. We talked about that fairly extensively last week. But our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence among you will be greatly enlarged. Verse 16, So we may preach the gospel in lands beyond you without boasting of work already done in another's area of influence. Verse 17, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Now, what's the common phrase in all of this? Boast. Boasts, plural. Notice that it's plural. And boasting. So, how do we connect all this boasting with the concept of foolishness? So we gotta connect some dots. So how do we do that? As we said, he's already said the foolishness of physical comparisons. Yeah. Yeah, so he's already established that. He's already said that, and he'll continue to say that in a number of places. But the part of the connection here is the false teachers, he's using a rhetorical style related to boasting for the Corinthians church's own good. And it's almost as if he's feeling silly for having to do this. Now let's go forward. I'm interloping a little bit on folks who follow me. In chapter 11, go to verse 16. I don't know who's got that pericope, so I apologize for that. But let's look at beginning in verse 16. He says, I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if I do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. Again, beginning to make some connections. What am I saying with this boastful confidence? I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Again, this kind of satirical thought. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. A whole lot of sarcasm there. Verse 23 now, are they servants of Christ? Am I a better one? I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, and countless beatings, and so forth and so on. Which I'm sure Casey or someone will detail all that out. A lot of stuff in there. And then go over to chapter 12. We're going to go, go to a whole new chapter, chapter 12. Look at verse 6. He says, though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But if I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Then go down to chapter 12, verse 11. I have been a fool. And notice the causative. You forced me to it. A little sarcasm, but a whole lot of other thought there. For I ought to have been commended by you, for I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, and they detail that out, even though I am nothing. So he continues this thought, this satire, this satirical kind of thing, about what the false teachers have been saying about him, and that the Corinthians have in some sense bought into. So he's inviting the readers of this letter, which would primarily be the Corinthians, he's inviting them to join him in a little display of folly or foolishness. So he wants them to bear with him in this foolishness, but at the same time to see the truthfulness of his record of suffering for Christ and the church. This self-commendation of the false teachers was the fruit of conceit and vanity, while with Paul it was self-vindication. Although different in character and design, they had a common element. Both included self-praise. Both are called by the same word, boasting, and therefore he calls both foolishness or lack of sense. So,
Just to put it in modern parlance, it ain't bragging, it is.
yeah. And who said that? Huh? Well, yeah, but who said, okay. Yeah. I don't know how to phrase this. The one we typically think, who said it? If I can do what I say and do it, it ain't bragging. Huh? Yogi Berra. Come on, guys. You knew I was going to get a baseball example in there somewhere. So, okay.
They also say that baseball's 80% mental and 50% physical.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what I used to tell young pitchers. Pitching is 80% right here and 50% right here. I mean, 20% right here, so. Okay. Enough baseball. Let's get back to our text. So, okay, verse 2. For I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. Now we're gonna break this out because nearly every one of these words has meaning. And let's start with the first word. What's the first word? For. Could be translated because. And it points to the reason that Paul is encouraging his readers to put up with his foolishness or put up with his nonsense, put up with his pretense. And he guards his people with divine jealousy. Because the next phrase says, I feel a divine jealousy for you. Jealousy is fervent, zeal. It's used in two ways, in a good sense, but more often in a evil sense, meaning envy, jealousy, and underlying anger. So if we think about that contemporarily, probably one of the most destructive, I don't know how to phrase this. I'm almost tempted to say feeling. Jealousy is not a feeling. Jealousy is a state of being. So one of the most destructive states of being in our society would be that of envy. Jealousy is an angry, strong, powerful emotion or state of being that refuses to tolerate a rival. Dare I ask, anybody ever been there? Probably, in varying degrees. So, it can be a powerful motivator to an aggressive action. Sometimes it gets turned into behavior that is, in fact, aggressive. It's one of the most frequent causes of broken homes, broken hearts, and broken bodies in our society. So that's the secular piece. The book of Exodus, this is Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, tells us, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And throughout all of Scripture, there's also the emphasis on God's jealousy. So how do we make these two things jive? They're both true. We know they're both true. We have evidence of both. So how do we balance that? How does Paul balance it? What does he say? What's the descriptor? Divine. He's talking about divine jealousy, which puts a whole different frame on it. It's a godly jealousy, as he writes it literally, for these people. So he's talking to the Corinthians at this point. So we can know that jealousy can be both good and bad, positive and negative. So then applicationally, if we experience jealousy towards someone, we have a procedure, if you please. We have an option. We can ask ourselves, is my jealousy righteous? Is it righteous jealousy? Is it rightful jealousy? Or is it false? It begins to give us a standard. And in Paul's example, we see the difference here. We see what he's talking about. Because false jealousy is always selfish. It's always self-centered. It's nearly always concerned about my feelings, and that is a biggie today. It's possessive. It wants to control either the person or the situation. Therefore, it's dominating, often even cruel and tyrannical. Very destructive emotion. Usurps the right of others and insists on its own way. It is imposed on someone else, whether he likes it or not. If you're the recipient of somebody's jealousy, you probably don't have a lot of option in that. Now, you've got a lot of option in how you respond, but you don't have a lot of option that's being handed to you. Because it's so vicious in its cruelty and its tyranny, jealousy perhaps is the most destructive force in our society. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most destructive force, but it is one of the greater ones. But a true jealousy, a godly jealousy, on the other hand, is what Paul felt for the Corinthians. It's one that arises from a deep concern for the welfare of another. It becomes less concerned with self, and it's always manifested in a tenderness and thoughtfulness about someone else. So Paul gave us an applicational point to think about. That when we're experiencing jealousy, is it positive or negative? Is it worldly or is it divine? And how we distinguish that. Okay, next phrase, since or because I betrothed you to one husband. Now we need to look at this word betrothed. We kind of know what that means. We kind of know what it indicates. We would typically say engaged, not betrothed, but betrothed has a much greater meaning. Literally translated, betrothed means to adjust, to fit together appropriately. It indicates a father's betrothing his daughter to a man to be joined in marriage. Now, I'm not going to go into all the Jewish history, but that betrothal could last up to a year. It was a big deal in the Jewish culture. So here Paul, he likens his jealousy to that of a father who has betrothed his daughter to a young bridegroom. Now, you got to kind of stay with the metaphor, you got to kind of stay with the analogy, but he's talking to the church at Corinth like they are his daughter that's been betrothed to this young man. Now, hold on to a young man because we're coming back to that. As a founder of the church, he's acting like a parent to betroth them to who? Christ. The analogy begins to break down, but the betrothal is to Christ, not to a person. And we have the Old Testament idea of God as husband. We find that in Isaiah 53, and Isaiah 53 and chapter 62, and we also find it in Hosea in the first 3 chapters. So Hosea spends a lot of time with this. Now, let's put a little foundation on this as well. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians. We're going to be going back and forth, so put your finger in there. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. And remember, we're laying foundation here. Paul says, "For though you have countless gods in Christ, you do not have many," what? "Fathers. For I became your father in Christ Jesus through the gospel." So he's establishing himself as their spiritual father. And therefore, he has a personal interest in the in the Christians at Corinth. And he guards them like a father would guard protectively over his daughter before she's given in marriage. A nice example, nice analogy here. Notice that Paul says, "I betrothed you," or "I give you in marriage." And again, if we go back to that definition of betrothal, I'll get it out in a minute. The basic meaning is to fit together, to adjust, to fit appropriately. And thus in English we have the derivative of harmony. Isn't that cool? Or to join together to give in marriage. So the church at Corinth is engaged to be married. And Paul serves as a friend of the bridegroom. Remember, the bridegroom is whom? Christ. To say he's a friend sounds a little something. But he's associated with, he knows the bridegroom. And he's the guardian of the bride. So we have a really good, kind, neat picture here of what Paul is talking about in this verse. So. Next phrase, one husband or one man, depending on the version you're reading. So this illustrates the intended monogamy in which one man and one woman pledge faithfulness to one another. Now we can take off in a lot of directions on this one, but this is specifically what Paul is telling us here with the analogy of the Corinthian church and Christ. So the man is Christ. The woman is the Corinthian church. Now Christ's loyalty to the church is beyond question. I mean, we know that. We wouldn't even need to talk about that here. And Paul does not talk about that here. But the fidelity of the Corinthians demands Paul's protective care and watchfulness. So he does talk about that. Okay, next phrase, to bring you as a pure virgin to Christ. This is the Old Testament terminology for a marriage. We didn't run those references, but you can go find those. Now, we are going to run this one because Paul repeats this same theme, and this is very familiar. You'll recognize this one. Go to Ephesians chapter 5. You may be able to quote this from memory. Chapter 5, beginning in verse 25. And he says, husbands. He's talking about human husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Familiar? Sound familiar? Remember this? That he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy without blemish. Now, this is typically taken to mean when the church is presented to Christ as his bride in the eschaton. But it also has applications for what Paul is writing to the Corinthian church and at this point in time. So how would this relate to the text at hand? How would we connect that? Would you agree that they're connected? Okay, I have partial agreement. Any objections? I'm kidding. Never mind. So they are connected, but how might we relate the Ephesians text to the text at hand? Well, we look at every word. Every word is filled with meaning, and Paul undoubtedly has chosen these words carefully. So we're back to him being careful, not foolish. So we've switched back to his primary way of presenting things. So
Difficult for him surely to joke about being holy without blemish in context of marriage.
yeah,
So he probably figured it out.
yeah.
Okay, I've given you all the scorn I'm going to give you right now. Now I'm going to teach you.
Yeah, and as we'll see as we go through some more, we're going to see, excuse me, he becomes very serious. And when he begins to talk about some of these things that the false prophets, I'm in the Old Testament now, let me get back to where we're supposed to be. False teachers are doing, and he detailed some of that later on, as we'll see. So he's presenting himself as a parent who has sought and found a suitable husband for his marriageable daughter. So he is responsible for the spiritual purity of the Corinthian congregation, which he wants to present to Christ. Now, we can take that two ways. He wants to present it to Christ in the sense that they're being, quote, pure currently, and then ultimately to be presented as a pure church to Christ in the eschaton. So it's one of those dualities. Paul desires that the Corinthians should remain faithful to their vows so as to be presented to Christ as a glorious church without spot or wrinkle on that great day. He dreaded that they should on that day be rejected and held in contempt as a woman unfaithful to her vows. So again, it goes back to that example. So Paul exerts himself to keep the church pure from doctrine, we're back to orthodoxy, contrary to the gospel that he strives to present her to Christ. So he's beginning now to move into this whole area where he's going to challenge what these false teachers are saying. He's defending himself, but he's going to defend the false doctrine they're teaching. He is also subtly rebuking the Corinthian Christians for even listening to the itinerant false teachers. So again, there's a dual concept. So in a sense, those who support the false teachers had become spiritually unfaithful, or the Old Testament concept of spiritual adultery. Okay, that brings us to verse 3. I think we're going to stop there because we're going to take 3 apart almost word by word as well. And we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes back. We'll assemble upstairs in a little bit, and then Lord willing, we'll pick up with verse 3 next week.